police killings. In 2015, a 43-year-old man named Sam Dubose was shot by a Cincinnati University police officer who happened to be wearing a Confederate flag shirt under his uniform at the time, and who, after two hung juries, was not convicted for the killing, which was caught on a body cam. So, Cincinnati kind of represents this pivot in terms of the nature of protest and the nature of federal response to, again, exceptional incidents of police violence, where a pattern or practice investigation leading to a consent decree is often called. We saw this in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and now pattern or practice investigations are underway in Minneapolis and Louisville. But again, the reforms in the end, and these investigations end up usually pumping more money into local police, because it costs upwards of usually $500 million to actually implement the reform. So it always marks another investment in police, instead of, again, rethinking our punitive priorities in general. And I know I sound like a dead horse, but going back to the kind of robust crime prevention program that the Kerner Commission imagined back in 1968.
Which is just it is investing in communities, not in the policing of communities,
exactly.
but in the communities itself. Have we entered in a different era? It seems that maybe the catalyst for, we just had a year or 8 months of the biggest uprising rebellion that the country has seen in decades. What it's brought about, it seems to me, at least in terms of like material changes, is nominal. You have some cities we've cut our police budget by 5% maybe, and we bought some hotels and we're housing the homeless, or we're shifting some of the responsibilities of the police, which seems to me to be the right direction, but it's barely getting on the on-ramp, as it were. But in terms of the response of people, are we in a different era? And do you think how durable do you think that era is?
So in some ways, so there's a lot of different layers, I think, to that question. On the one hand, I think, there is a big distinction between the rebellions from the 60s through Cincinnati and what we saw during Obama's second term, beginning with Ferguson. And that is that, from Ferguson onwards, the violence began after. So the violence always started at peaceful protests, nonviolent protests, or vigils. And it was only after police came in with tear gas on peaceful protesters, with their batons. We saw this last summer in Minneapolis. We saw it in Ferguson, that then some of the protesters turned violent. So instead of it being, violence at the very beginning, it is, again, violence in response to police violence. So in some ways, the protests have become more nonviolent and the police violence has been sustained. And I think, that's something really important that we're seeing, that's a new development in these protests. And they're much more the violence itself. The kind of, multiracial character of the protests, and the fact that so many of the protests for racial justice occurred in majority white or all white communities, is important and highlights perhaps the durability. But the problem is, we have to move beyond police reform, and we have to move beyond the police themselves as a solution if we really, really want to tackle these problems and prevent killings in the future. And I think that's where, bringing about, and this actually gets to a question you asked earlier, which is, or a point that you made earlier, which is like, why is it that these recommendations that always get made never actually get adopted? And that's because people have been so resistant to making the kinds of structural changes that are going to be necessary. And so, I think the durability depends on, one, keeping the pressure, this emerging protest movement and these emerging coalitions, keeping the pressure on elected officials, because we know that, policymakers don't make changes out of the goodness of their hearts. It takes pressure from the people, and an ongoing campaign among hearts and minds to, expand our knowledge and understanding of the ways in which racist policies shape so many political and economic institutions in this country. And, given the pushback that we're seeing now, to, even the most basic reforms and to that version of history that centers racial oppression and exploitation, we have our work cut out for us. But, I'm the younger generation makes me hopeful. The people who sustained the protest movements last summer and my students, they came of age during the Trump administration and COVID and these protests. And I think they want to, in their lifetime, they're committed to fighting for a different kind of governance, one that's based on expanding opportunities and equality and not on policing and surveillance that sustains the mass incarceration society that we've been living in since the civil rights movement.
I want to just turn to sort of that concept of just like, what constitutes, abolishing the police in your mind. But before we get there, just briefly, do you think that's a tactic? I mean, it does seem to me that the police being more aggressive in the past, 6-8 years in addressing these protests seems to be like a tactic. Like there is an awareness of we need there to be violence, and it doesn't really matter if we start it. We need there to be violence because that violence justifies, at least in the predominant narrative, our existence.
Yes.
Do you think that's a tactic? Because it just seems like, and we should be clear. Police departments talk with each other. They have conferences. They get together. They share these strategies.
I think it's complicated. I think that police officers see themselves as threatened and under attack. And I don't know how conscious of a tactic it is, but I think especially, since Michael Brown and the protests in Ferguson and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think police officers, again, lacking a really nuanced understanding about policing and the way that that the logic of policing has functioned historically in this country to advance the social control and surveillance of people of color. Police officers see their own livelihoods in danger, and also see the low income communities of color that they're charged with protecting supposedly as the enemy and as latently criminal. And protesters, we know, protests for racial justice have always been criminalized. We see in the civil rights movement, nonviolent demonstrations, the responses, German shepherds and hoses. And racial justice is seen by law enforcement authorities as a direct threat for reasons like that you say to their own purpose and well-being. And so I do think that there is a genuine feeling among officers that they're under attack too. But this reflects, again, so much misinformation and divisions within our society where we're unable to see our common ground.
We got to take just a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have 2 minutes. And I just want to, at that point, just like get a broad sense of what we need to do, what the difference between reform and abolish is when we talk about the police. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back in just a moment. All right, so Elizabeth Hinton, we just have a couple minutes here, but when we talk about, obviously we can pull back from or stop providing military equipment to police departments on a federal level, right? On a federal level, what else can we do besides like cut off funding so that cities have to shrink their police force? Is it enough to shrink it? Is it enough to say like we're going to have like, we're going to have cops who are going to investigate murders? You can investigate murders, but you're not going to do traffic stops. You're not going to do evictions. You're not going to do you just don't need to have that type of contact with the public.
Right. And we're beginning to see, this kind of a model being implemented. So in Ithaca, New York, for instance, the city council and the police union voted in April to abolish the police department and to replace it with the department, what's now called the Department of Community Solutions and Public Safety, which is doing exactly that, which is saying we don't need a uniformed officer with a gun to be the first responder to a number of problems and issues and situations that officers are deployed to. So for traffic stops, you don't need to have a gun. For domestic violence disputes, you don't need to send a police officer. You could send a social worker. You could there's a whole host of other institutions that can replace what police officers are doing. And police officers themselves will tell you they don't want to be responsible, and they're not trained to be responsible for mental health crises and familial disputes and all kinds of things that, because of the shrinking of the welfare state, police are now charged to do. But I think, again, going back to that critical moment in the 1960s, and again, thinking beyond police, there's the funding of community action programs through the War on Poverty, through this principle called maximum feasible participation, allowed the federal government to fund grassroots organizations directly under the idea that, people in the community know best how to address the needs of the community. And I'd like to see us return to this policy precedent. I'd like to see in addition to, not giving more money to police,
if I could
funding grassroots organizations who are doing the best work out there.
All right, Elizabeth Hinton, the book is America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. As we wrap up the show, we will see you folks on Peacock tomorrow. And apologies, Professor, we had to sign off from one of our syndicates.
You tried to squeeze in such a big question into. I'm looking at the clock.
I know.
It's less than 2 minutes left.
I know. Well, we have a little more time now to finish up that answer. So let's, if we could, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but these block grants,
yes,
community programs,
yes.
And the idea being, allow communities to invest directly into areas that they can see on the ground what need to be supported.
Right.
And presumably on a local level, the cities will do what essentially Ithaca did, which is we're going to, and I guess it's maybe just a semantics question as to like, we're going to change the name of our police department and we're going to shrink its portfolio essentially. And maybe they can work in conjunction with these other community services.
Right.
But, and from a federal level, we could do at least the first part of it, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to change what happens in the context of the cities, but we can provide incentives to sort of change the way that they're doing it.
Yeah, I think we can provide incentives. I think that we can begin to support these community groups that are envisioning and executing a completely different approach to public safety. And, I think, and this is one thing that's a little bit more controversial, but, instead of thinking about defund, we can think about changing our tax system to create more dollars to fund these community-based cost-effective programs that do have a demonstrated impact on crime, and on violence in the most vulnerable communities. I think, what we know is that investing in police and prisons has not worked, to foster greater public safety in our most vulnerable communities. That's the lesson of the past, half century or so. And now it's time to try a different set of policy responses to racial inequality and poverty and crime and gun violence in our communities.
All right. Since I have a law professor here, I have to ask this question of you. Do you think there's any type of a potential legal strategies that can go hand in hand with this agenda? Are there I mean, it's hard for me to sort of imagine, but are there legal strategies? Are there cases that could be brought that might sort of have some type of resonance within a federal circuit or something?
So I do think that lawyers have an important role to play. I mean, it's almost impossible to prove discriminatory intent, but I think that lawyers can file lawsuits and support cases that can expose the deep discrimination within our system, and also to help municipalities as they navigate the kind of legal challenges of what dissolving, as in the case of Ithaca, a police department might look like. And thinking about, how we can roll back some of the, which is already underway,